Great. Thank you, Jesse. So the talk will be new supply chains in critical minerals, and it will focus on lithium battery recycling and polymetallic C nodules to talk about some new ideas. I spoke earlier this morning. I filled in for one of the speakers. I couldn't make it. So the first couple slides, if you were here in the morning, some of them are similar and you heard the story, but I'll tell it again for the first few slides. Just a bit of a word on who is SGS. Our company is a leader in certification, inspection, and analysis, and we work across every major supply chain in the world. 96,000 employees, so quite large and diverse. And I sit on the SGS Natural Resources team. We work across the entire supply chain, all the way from exploration through to feasibility studies, construction, production, and all the way through closure and recycling. And we have labs all over the world. So getting back to, again, similar theme, what I spoke about this morning, we are at the beginning of a sustained period for critical mineral demand, and this is driven mostly by chemical and automotive industry that are making a big push. These slides are from Benchmark Minerals in terms of their view, in terms of the long term, in terms of us achieving net zero 2050. And the point is today we're on a path of 0.6 terawatt hours of annual capacity. That's the blue line on the left graph, but it's not enough. We need to achieve an annual output of 20 terawatts of lithium-ion battery output just to meet that long-term goal. So there's a lot of work to be done. But on the other side, where are these commodities going to come from? And that translates, we're going to need somewhere between 50 and 60 million tons a year of commodities to feed this supply chain. And it's not all going to come from mining. 50% of it will come from mining, but they're forecasting that a significant portion, 40%, will come from recycling activities. And plus there'll be new elements because battery chemistries will change, they'll evolve, and we will no doubt add other components, other elements to the battery chemistry that will be to be found. So therefore, in the shorter term, we do expect to have supply shortages. We will see aggressive mine project development, which is why we're seeing more government funding, whether it's EU, Canada, US, and so forth. And as a result, just to meet 2030 demand, we'll need 50 lithium mines, 60 nickel mines, and 17 cobalt mines. We need leadership out there in terms of major companies, whether it's mining companies, OEMs out there giving us a vision. This is what Tesla did in March. They produced their master plan part 3. So it wasn't just about electric vehicles. This was their vision on electricity supply for the vision for the future. And their theme was the current energy economy is wasteful. And based on global energy supply today, which is about 165 petawatt hours per year of energy supply. And a reminder for those who aren't used to petawatts, it's 1,000 terawatts. It's a huge, massive number. And as we can see in what Tesla's done to show us that, hey, 134 petawatt hours is supplied by fossil fuels. So only a small percentage so far is supplied by renewables. And a lot of that ends up in terms of waste heat per their own analysis. And what they said is, well, based on their vision, we could do a lot better. We could displace 125 petawatt hours per year fossil fuels and replace that with 66 petawatt hours of sustainably generated electricity. And of course, to get there, there's a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of things that have to happen, but they're providing that vision of the future. So let's talk a little bit about battery recycling. We've heard there's a lot of incentives, government policies. It's not all about just building mines, electric vehicles. We also need the circular economy. So we need to think about what we're going to do for battery recycling. So that's one of the new sources in these new supply chains. It will grow. And at present, most of the recycled batteries are coming from the automotive production scrap. That's what's driving it today. That's that light blue line in terms of demand. But as the end of life for lithium-ion batteries, as these vehicles come back, an OEM will say their battery should last, let's say, 15, 20 years. But maybe in reality, maybe it's closer to somewhere between, let's say, 10 and 20 years in terms of life. We'll start seeing those end-of-life batteries come back into the market. There is some debate between analysts. Well, will they go to secondary sources? Maybe we're not going to recycle them immediately. They'll go to other countries where they could be used for other purposes. So the analysts can duke that out. But the point being, the production scrap line and the end of life for the vehicles coming back from on the road, somewhere at the end of this decade, they'll cross. And those end of life vehicles will overtake the production scrap. Therefore, battery recycling is going to become quite big as we move towards that end of decade. And every OEM right now is adopting and making relationships with battery recycling companies. I will say that recycling is still not yet a mature market. There's a lot of companies running out there. They have their own IP. And so we say, what are the different entry points if you're a battery recycling company? So most have their own dedicated, their own IP. So they're marketing their own process to recover these commodities. Or maybe you're an OEM or a battery company who wants to invest in battery recycling. We also know there's chemical companies that are interested in developing their own flow sheets because they obviously want to sell the reagents and other services for these battery recycling flow sheets. And there's trading companies for the same obvious reasons that they want to get into investing into the sector, because there's a lot that, they want to get involved in the supply chain in terms of the output of all those recycled materials. So I'll just say there's a lot of things happening on that side of the business. Now, to contrast, how does recycling compare to mining environment? It is different. Because when it comes to mining projects, they have guidelines and regulations related to public disclosure based on being listed on whether it's Canadian Stock Exchange, Australian Stock Exchange, New York, and so forth. And so we have, in Canada, NI 43-101 for these guidelines. Australia, we have JORC. In the US, we have SK 1300. So when you're looking at a project and they have to disclose information about the geological resource, reserves, feasibility studies, that information is public. When it comes to recycling projects, it's not the same. So if you go on an exchange, often that recycling information is protected because they're applying for their patents and they don't want to reveal the secret sauce to their flow sheet. So it's a lot different from a public disclosure point of view. And so I always like to try to point that out. There are differences in the industry in terms of what you could see when it comes to getting visibility into these projects. So battery recycling is, I'll say, young, and it's still developing from that point of view. And in fact, these are chemical plants, and they're treated differently in terms of the market view. So I just want to talk a bit about what's in the battery. So when we talk about recycling of lithium-ion batteries, often people don't really talk about the chemistry. What's in there? Where's the economic drivers? And so based on the current chemistries, so we had Kimberly earlier talk a little bit about the battery chemistries. Here's some examples of our clients that we've worked with over the last few years. And most of the economic value sits with the nickel and cobalt. So it's effectively like a nickel mine with some, extra cobalt goodies. Because just looking, the sum of nickel and cobalt makes somewhere around, let's say, 25, just under 30% of the economic value in terms of what's in a recycled battery. And that image is a shredded battery, by the way, in terms of, working in the lab. But you could see what else is in there, right? Manganese, 2 to 5%. Copper, this would be just the copper wiring in the battery. And lithium, we call it lithium-ion battery, but the lithium content as the electrolyte was really just 3 to 4%. So the major economic value really sits in the nickel and cobalt if we're saying, well, what's going to drive this economic process? Because if you're going to have a company, you got to make sure you capture value on the front end. And from a volume perspective, graphite is the big one. right? So somewhere around 40% plus or minus, a huge part of that battery from a volume point of view. So we need all these commodities that work together. They don't work alone, although the battery chemistries change. More or less, we need, like I said, some ratio of these to make things work. Now I'm going to talk about one of these other supply chains, polymetallic C nodules. So somewhere in the, I'll say, in the Pacific Ocean is one of the large places where these C nodules reside. It is contentious because some people will say, hey, well, we're not really comfortable maybe from the environmental point of view or sustainability. I leave that for the capital markets to decide. In terms of investors want to invest, I'm sure they'll help make that happen if and when those companies can demonstrate, that responsibility from a supply chain. I'm strictly talking about from a processing point of view and extracting these commodities, but they do represent a tremendous potential supply chain. And like I said, from the seafloor, there are hydrothermal vents, and there are millions of resources of tons of these C nodules scattered on the seafloor. So the question in terms of a processing point of view is what happens when the material comes to onshore? How do you process it? Obviously, like I said, in a environmentally sensitive point of view, what do you do? But the same questions apply to conventional mining projects, meaning what is the CapEx, what is the OpEx, what is the metallurgical performance when you extract the commodities from these C nodules? And by the way, in a C nodule, and I'll show you the next slide, it is concentrated copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, all the good things that we're looking for in any mining deposit. But going back to, like I said, how does it compare to conventional mining deposit? Same thing in the seafloor. What is the mineral variability? Right? If you're gonna recover those nodules, like I said, how much variance you're going to see on your feed material? What is the flow sheet? And are there any benchmarks for processing? There are, I will say, a lot of projects that are looking at extraction of commodities from C nodules today. A lot of these are private. They're not visible, but they are out there, and I know because we work on them. So now I'll give you some numbers, kind of give you an idea. So right now, although the numbers change, there's an estimated resource of 3 trillion, so I said million, but 3 trillion tons of contained nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese on the ocean floor. And like any project, it comes back to what is potentially economic, right? But also when it comes to projects, it's the same. It's environmental permitting, social responsibility. All those aspects matter for a project. The two main regions, if anyone wants to look it up afterwards, it's the Clarion-Clipperton zone and the Cook Island region. So Pacific, the Pacific is the main area. And the difference, this is not like a concentrate, physical upgrading is not possible. You have to have a process that looks at whole ore treatment. So if we compare those two zones, and these are just examples, of course it varies, but these just to show everyone in the audience, what is the typical composition in a C nodule? In the Clarion-Clipperton zone, it is higher grade on both the nickel and the copper. And hey, those are great grades, 1% copper and 1% nickel. Those make great mines from a typical, something on land. And the manganese content is also quite high from that perspective. And if we compare it to Cook Islands, it is lower in copper and nickel as well. But it does, like I said, still represent some potential, good economics. Now to talk about, I'll say, a typical potential processing flow sheet. There are several. This is just more, again, to show one of them. There's probably, I'll say, 3 or good 4 process flow sheets out there that the companies are looking at technologies, or in terms of their process recovery. This one involves both a pyrometallurgical and a hydrometallurgical flow sheet. The manganese silicate is taken out in the first step after pyrometallurgy. And, basically we're recovering copper cathode, This is actually done in the lab. This is an old picture, but we're producing cobalt sulfate, nickel sulfate as products, as well as ammonium sulfate as well. And you can see again in the picture in the left, these sea nodules about the size of my fist from that point of view. Now, kind of in closing, going back to these new supply chains, you need to invest on the test work. You need to invest on the pilot plant aspects of extracting these commodities and de-risking the project. So why is this important? And that's why one thing I wanted to mention, we need to value the project development phase like insurance, right? We don't want to build something there is risk in these new flow sheets. So how do you de-risk it? Spend more on the front end to help de-risk it when you're getting to that construction phase later. And that means that you'll benefit both during the bench testing phase as well as the pilot plant operation. This is McNulty curves, if anyone's familiar with this. This is looking at ranking different projects based on the how much did they meet the design capacity when they moved to operation, commissioning, startup commissioning and operation. And depending on this, I'll say the success of what went into the project on the front end reflects whether it met that design capacity or not. And so projects that have McNulty curves 1 and 2 are more successful, and it reflects the person that came up with this said, hey, they're based because people used mature technology, a good understanding of the feed material, extensive pre-operation test work, as well as piloting test work. And then if we compare it to the ones on the lower end, why did they maybe not achieve the design capacity when they started up? And part of the list was, well, they're complex, they're new metallurgy, so there is inherently more risk. Poor understanding of the feed material. Did you select the right samples representative of that material in terms of plant operation? And maybe those companies didn't have either the budget to spend on doing the right work, right? Limited pre-operating, piloting, and test work. So to give you a real life example, the Linus rare earth plant in Malaysia, this is just overlaying their success in starting up. And they pretty much kind of follow that McNulty 4 curve of when you don't do things maybe ideally. I'll say the only drop was because of COVID at the end of this chart, but some of this is, you can avoid this, right? You need to invest on the front end project. So that's why I always want to, add that in. So, and with that, I open to questions.